Hey y'all, this is Brown at I Have Brown, and as part of my ongoing coverage of Essential X-Men Volume 7, we're going to be talking about issues 215 and 216 today. So, issue 215 is called Old Soldiers, and Alan Davis not only did the cover art, but he did the interior art for this issue as well. In this particular issue, it introduces us to a character of Crimson Commando, Stonewall, and Super Sabre. There's Storm fighting them in the middle. And going from there, we have issue 216 with the title Crucible. And Barry Windsor Smith did the cover art for this issue, and he also did the wonderful guest art for last issue, namely issue 214, which was with Malice Toward All, and it was the last issue I reviewed. But while he did the cover art, it was Jackson Guice who did the interior art, and I have some fond memories of his artwork in the 90s, especially his Superman stuff. So seeing Jackson Guice do some X-Men artwork, some interior artwork was pretty cool to see. And once again, Chris Claremont writes the stories, and he continues to craft a memorable tale, as well as fleshing out familiar characters and introducing us to some new ones. So the story, it's basically a two-part storyline focusing mainly on Storm and Wolverine, but it starts off with the character of Madelyne Pryor, of all people. So the last time we had seen her, she was being brought into a hospital suffering from multiple gunshot wounds, and we don't know who we don't know who shot her or why. And so the story opens up with her having this nightmarish flashback, and she is reliving this airline crash that she was the sole survivor of. So basically she had been the main pilot on this passenger plane with a lot of people on board, and something went wrong and the plane went down. And I mean, that was bad enough right there. I mean, and it probably would have resulted in most, if not all, the passengers getting killed anyway. But unfortunately, someone had the bright idea to try and smuggle some military grade explosives onto the plane for the purpose of transportation, from one spot to another, probably black market stuff or something like that. And so when the plane went down, it triggered the explosives, which resulted in this devastating explosion, which killed everyone on board except for Madelyne Pryor. And she was the only one to walk away, and she barely had a scratch on her. And so it's something that's haunted her ever since. But as she's reliving this memory and having this nightmare about it, she's looking at the fire and how it's dancing before her, and she's saying how, in her mind, she's thinking about how it's making all these strange images. And at one point, this bird seems to, this bird made of pure flame it sort of comes up from the fire for a little bit, and then it goes back down. And so you see that, and you hear her talking about it, you're like, yeah, I'm sure that was just a coincidence that there was like a phoenix-like imagery there. Total coincidence, right? So going from there, the dream changes, and she's being taken into an ambulance, but her clothing has been changed, and she gets the feeling that she's in a more current memory. But with that in mind, she starts to remember how her husband, Scott Summers, had run out on her and her son Nathan without telling them why. And we as readers, come to learn that the reason he ran out on his wife and son was because he found out that Jean Grey, who was the love of his life, was found alive somehow. And so considering that her dying on the moon during the whole Dark Phoenix saga was something that really was very, very much a tragedy that still haunts him. Him finding out that Jean Grey was still alive is something that really shook him up. And so but yeah, I mean, that's basically why he ran out on his wife and sons. But thing is, he didn't tell them that. I mean, he didn't say, "Hey, honey, I just got a call from a friend and found out that the woman that I was in a relationship with, I thought she was dead, but she's been found alive. I need to check this out. Yeah, y'all want to come with? I mean, it could have been something like that, you know. But the thing is, like, no, he just ran out on them, you know, no word whatsoever. So, I mean, I know Scott Summers. I mean, yeah, like he definitely had, you know, his good moments as a leader and everything of the X-Men, but unfortunately, like, that's a douchebag move that, you know, irreparably tarnished him, at least in my eyes, you know. So anyway, Madelyne Pryor, though, she's remembering all this, and then she realizes that her son's missing. Her son's not with her, and she's like, you know, where's my baby? You know, where is he? And because she knows that somehow she knows that he was taken from her, but she doesn't know who took him or why. And so in this, you know, ambulance, you know, she starts freaking out, and the paramedics actually turn out to be Marauders, namely Scalp Hunter and Arclight. And so Madelyne's actually able to get out of the ambulance and, you know, lead them on a brief chase, but then they easily catch up to her, and Scalp Hunter shoots her multiple times. And so that's the last thing she remembers before she starts to wake up. And so coming back into reality, you know, we're in the hospital, and, you know, the doctors are, you know, talking about her, you know, and while she's on the bed and, you know, in a coma. And the doctors are saying that, you know, when she was first brought in, I mean, they did what they could for her, but they had little hope. But she actually made it through the night, and her body's actually healing remarkably well, all things considered. But which kind of surprised them, considering, you know, how badly she was injured. But then, unfortunately, they're not able to get her out of her coma. I mean, she's resisted any attempt for them to, you know, wake her up. And so, considering she was brought in and she without any form of ID, she's listed in their records as a Jane Doe. And so, considering that they're, you know, short on beds, they're gonna have her, you know, transported to a custodial facility where the state will pick up the tab since she's a Jane Doe. But right when they're talking about that, she starts to wake up. And so, you know, the doctors, I mean, they're all, you know, calm and soft-spoken with her, and, you know, tell her who they are and where she's at, and they ask her who she is, and she tells them, you know, my name's Madelyne Pryor. And so this is the first, you know, solid, you know, bit of identification that they have on her. And so they finally, you know, have something, a name. But at the same time, you know, we don't know why exactly the Marauders were going after her or tried to kill her. And we also, you know, don't know why she doesn't have any ID on her either. And so, you know, at this point, you know, you get the idea that, you know, someone, you know, tried to kill her and erase her, you know, but we don't know why. We know the Marauders, you know, were the ones who tried to kill her, and apparently, you know, took any form of identification off her body, but we don't know why they targeted her specifically, or why, you know, her forms of identification were gone. And so, so at this point, you know, we're just kind of chalking it up to, you know, the Marauders, you know, living up to, you know, their, you know, tactic of, you know, getting at the X-Men through their friends and loved ones. And so, since Madelyne Pryor was the, you know, the wife of, you know, Scott Summers, and yeah, so there you go. But in the meantime, though, we cut to the X-Men, and they're in the process of loading up a plane with their 3 injured members, Kitty Pryde, aka Shadowcat, Kurt Wagner, aka Nightcrawler, and Peter Rasputin, aka Colossus, because all 3 of them had been gravely injured by the Marauders during the whole Mutant Massacre storyline. Nightcrawler is still in a coma from his wounds, and Colossus is stuck in his organic metal form and is paralyzed, literally. And Shadowcat is stuck in her intangible form, and she's breaking down on a cellular level, to such a degree that, eventually she's just going to fade away. And so the best they can do for her is to, have her in this sort of, energy, storage containment unit. But so the three of them are being loaded up on this plane to be taken to Muir Island, where Moira McTaggart and her medical team, who have been working with the Morlocks, the few surviving Morlocks of the massacre, they're gonna, do their best to try and care for the injured X-Men as well, because the X-Men, they're very limited as far as their medical facilities, and the majority of what they had went to Moira McTaggart so she could help the Morlocks. So joining them, though, you have Rogue, Psylocke, and new members Longshot and Dazzler. So Psylocke, though, is asking Storm if it's really a good idea to split the X-Men up like this, because she and Wolverine are staying behind. And Callisto even chimes in, Callisto being the leader of the Morlocks, and she was pointing out that it doesn't matter how far we run, the Marauders are going to come after us no matter where we go. And so Storm, she's pointing out that Moira McTaggart is the only one that we can trust, who has the medical equipment to help the three injured team members. And also because of the fact that the Marauders are such a threat, and they've proven willing to strike at the X-Men by going after their friends and loved ones, Moira McTaggart and her medical team are more than likely going to need all the help they can get. And so, just to be on a safe side, that's why the majority of the X-Men are being sent, on this plane with the three injured members. So that way, not only will the three injured team members have protection, but so will Moira McTaggart and her medical team. And so, and Callisto is going with them too, because she wants to be with the few surviving Morlocks that are being tended to by Moira and her medical team. And so, while they go to Scotland, to Muir Island in Scotland, Storm and Wolverine go on a bit of a side mission. And so Storm was wanting to check out this family member of the late Jean Grey, and this particular family member, I think she was a sister who was a mutant rights activist, and she'd gotten a lot of death threats. And so not only was she wanted to check on her just to make sure she's okay, but also was wanting to make sure that the Marauders weren't going to attack her, because her being a mutant rights activist kind of put a bigger target on her head. But there's been no communication from her from her home phone for several days now. And so she's wanting to go there to check it out and just make sure things are okay, and she's asking Wolverine to go with her. But Wolverine at this point is still mentally shaken up, not only from the trauma of the whole mutant massacres event, the attack of the Marauders in general, but in the fact that some of his best friends were injured so badly, but also, the main thing that's really gotten to him is that the Marauder Malice had taken possession of him very easily, I might add, and while in control of him, he nearly killed some of his fellow friends and team members. And so he does not react well to being taken control of, or losing control of himself. And so he's still kind of shaken up from it all. And so Storm's saying, look, the rest of the X-Men are going to Muir Island. I need you to have my back. And so he's like, okay, I'll go with you. And the two of them, they go to, Jean Grey's, sister's place. But when they get there, they find out that the whole place has been blown up. And so, Wolverine's, checking around, and he's using his, sense of smell. And Storm, she's looking around, and the two of them, find evidence that, the house was blown up by way of explosives. And so, and they're like, well, who did this? And they don't know if it was like an anti-mutant, hate attack, or if it was, say, the Marauders. Like, they don't know for sure. And Wolverine's saying that he's not picking up any of the Marauders' scents, but he does pick up a scent that, sends him over the edge, namely the scent of Jean Grey. Okay, and so for context, all right, the X-Men, knew of Jean Grey. She had died on the moon during the whole Dark Phoenix saga. Like, they saw her die. Okay. But they aren't aware that Jean Grey had actually been found recently alive, as I had mentioned with the whole bit with Cyclops, and they don't know about her and Cyclops joining up with Angel and Beast and Iceman to form a new team called X Factor. Like, they don't know that they're not aware of X Factor, and they're also not aware that X Factor is made up of, the 5 original X-Men, and they certainly don't know that Jean Grey has been, discovered alive, So, this isn't the first time that Wolverine's picked up her scent, though, because during the whole Mutant Massacre story, there was a moment in the sewers where he picked up her scent, and he's like, no way, that can't be right. And so he's thinking that's gotta be a mistake, like wishful thinking or something. But the thing is, the X Factor team had been in the sewers as well, which is why he picked up her scent. But once again, the X-Men don't know about X Factor. So, so yeah, it's like the first time he's thinking is like, okay, I'm on edge, because of this crazy group of killer mutants, killing all these Morlocks and, hurting some of us. I'm on edge from that, but, maybe I'm just, cracking from that, but then now he picks up her scent again, and he just flips out, and, because he's already shaken, by the fallout from the whole Mutant Massacre storyline, and he's also shaken up from, the Marauder malice having possessed him. And so then now picking up Jean Grey's scent again, I mean, it literally drives him crazy. And, he actually, lashes out at Storm, not by intent, but, he's just like lashing out in general, and he accidentally hits her and knocks her out. And she has no idea why he's freaking out. And so Wolverine, runs off into the woods. And so Storm, when she comes to, she finds herself being held prisoner in this, stately old home, and, she's able to, get out of her restraints, using a lockpick that she'd secreted away, and she finds another prisoner, this, young woman who was probably in her early 20s, and, she, she briefly considers, trying to, free her too, but she's like, no, I need to get my bearings first. I need to find out where I am first. And so she kind of sneaks around the place, and she finds, all this, old World War II memorabilia all over the place. And, some of it, clearly from, battles that had been hard fought. And so she shortly meets the owners of the place. And they come back from having hunted someone down. Like, she hears them boasting about, how easy, the boy went down. And one of them was, disappointed at how quick the hunt ended. And so the 3 people turn out to be, these, former soldiers and superhumans from World War II, named Crimson Commando, Stonewall, and Super Sabre. And so Crimson Commando's kind of the leader of the team, and basically, I mean, from what we see of him, like, he's able to sort of read someone, like, physically, like he can sort of match you in combat, like not full on copycat, but he can read if you're about to make a move, that kind of thing. And so at this point, it's kind of ambiguous as to whether or not that's an actual superpower, or if he's just like exceptionally skilled, and like, say, on the levels of on the fighting level of Batman or something like that, if Batman had fought in World War II. And then you have Stonewall, who basically is incapable of being knocked over. So, like, if you try to push him, he's not going to fall over. He's kind of like the Blob, except imagine if the Blob was actually in shape, that kind of, and wasn't a total douchebag, But that's Stonewall in a nutshell. And Super Sabre is this, old guy who's a super speedster who can go at Mach 1. And so the three of them, they, introduce, after a bit of a scuffle with Storm, and they get her, back, under her control, or under their control. They introduce themselves to her and explain that they had fought in World War II, and they'd basically gone after a lot of war criminals, too. But then the government sort of turned their backs on them and said, hey, you guys, y'all fought the good fight, but it's time for y'all to retire. And so they did try to retire. They did try to have a nice quiet life, but unfortunately, though, when they went back to where their homes were, they saw that all this crime had moved in. And so as time went on, they saw how worse the crime was. Like, there was mafia problems, there were gang problems, there were drug problems in the area. And so and they finally got to a point where they felt like the government wasn't doing anything about it. And so they're like, is this what we fought and died for? Is this why we went to another country to fight evil there, and so many of our friends died, and then we get back here and it's starting to look just like that over there, like it was over there. And so you definitely have a sense of lingering PTSD with them. But then at the same time, they make some interesting points. I mean, because they say that they decide to sort of take the law into their own hands, to hunt down the ones that the law didn't punish, like the ones that were legitimately guilty, but the law just basically let them go with a slap on the wrist, if that. But they make a point to tell Storm about the woman that she found, that you wouldn't know it to look at her, but she's actually the daughter of a very wealthy family. And she didn't have to live on the streets. She's living on the streets because she wanted a life of crime, she wanted a life of adventure. And so her and her boyfriend, who they had just gotten back from hunting down, her and her boyfriend ran a pretty big gang that was pushing drugs on school grounds. Okay, so, and a lot of kids ended up getting a hold of these drugs and getting either addicted to the drugs or killed by the drugs. But because of her family's connections, anytime she was taken in, they were just let go with a slap on the wrist. And so at that point they're like, you're on the list, kid. And so as they've done with other criminals who have escaped justice, they captured her and her boyfriend, who, as I mentioned, were the heads of this gang, and they brought them to their home in the woods, and they explained to Storm that what we do is we hunt them down. But we're not monsters. Unlike the ones we pursue, we're not monsters. We give them a chance. We give them a certain amount of time, to make it out of the woods. But once the sun goes down, that's when we hunt them. And if we catch them, they're dead. And so, so they had basically, just gotten through hunting, the woman's boyfriend. And so it's one down, one to go, except now, Storm is involved. And the reason that, they brought her to their home and held her prisoner was because, while they were hunting the criminal boyfriend, they came across the ruins of the house, and it was clearly an arson job, and they found Storm, amongst the ruins, with certain, like certain pieces, like certain articles, certain personal effects, of Jean Grey's sister with her, like in a bag, and so in their eyes, they see this and they assume that Storm is a looter, and also seeing how she's dressed, because she's kind of dressed like a punk rocker almost, with the mohawk and everything, and so Storm. She explains, that the reason she had those personal articles on her was because she was, going to, take them, back to, her. I mean, she tells them who she is, like in that she's a member of the X-Men, but she was basically going to take these personal articles, to the X-Men's base to examine them, see if she could find anything in the way of like fingerprints or anything like that, like anything that might have shown, who or what, destroyed, the house. And so, they're kind of like, even if you're telling the truth though, we still can't let you go. And Storm's like, of course, because now I know who you all are and I know what you do. And so basically she knows their secret, so to speak. And so, at that point, like the way she's carrying herself and everything, they, reluctantly admit that she's not acting like a criminal, but at the same time, they have no choice but to kill her though. But they're also going to give her the same chance that they're giving, their quarry, and in their latest, sport is, the woman, the one who is the leader of that gang. And so they send Storm and the woman off into the woods, so basically give them a head start. But, while Storm does her best to, help the woman to keep up and everything, she's really questioning things. And she's like, no, there's no doubt in my mind that they intend to kill us, but at the same time, is this, woman even worth protecting? Because, if she's the criminal that, that they're describing, plus the fact that she's even admitted that she's, the criminal that, they said she was, is even worth protecting her. And yet she's saying, but then again, how many of us X-Men, were once criminals? And, what if, no one had given us a chance, to turn over a new leaf? And so she's thinking that, maybe, if she helps this woman and the two of them make it out of the woods, and survive the hunt, she can, help the woman to, get set straight, so to speak, or try and start over. Or at the very least, turn her into the authorities where she'll answer for her crimes, but also, has a chance at life at least. But in the meantime, though, the three superhuman soldiers, they decide, they end up again to where it's like, okay, the sun's down, it's time for the hunt. And Storm had actually set a couple of traps for them, and there was a moment where she had set a trap that it was like a tripwire that could have very easily, cut through Super Sabre's neck as he, ran through it. But at the last minute, she undoes the trap because she realizes that that she had set a trap that, she had every intention of killing Super Sabre with, because, and the thing is, she's fought before to where, she's, mortally wounded an enemy, but here though, she's setting an ambush to kill an enemy, and she realizes what she's doing, and she can't bring herself to do it, and so when she undoes the trap, that's when the woman that's with her, sort of starts to turn on her and say, like, what the hell were you doing? I mean, we could have taken out one of them right then and there. And she says, that's not who I am. I'm not a killer. I mean, I will help you get out of the woods, but I'm not going to be a murderer. And so, but the more, they argue with one another, the more it becomes clear that this woman, is definitely, every bit the criminal that, the three old soldiers, were saying that she was. And unfortunately, they have a bit of a falling out, which results in, the woman pushing, these rocks onto, Storm and Super Sabre, because, Super Sabre ends up, coming across him and getting into a fight with Storm, and Storm's able to get the drop on him and everything, but the woman basically causes a bit of an avalanche of rocks that falls on them, and Storm's the only one who comes out of there. And so as far as we can tell, Super Sabre is buried under all this rubble, but in the meantime though, when it comes to, say, Wolverine, he's still in a feral state, but he ends up getting hit by a car, and which his couple was they're driving on the road, and Wolverine just sort of looms up at them and out of the darkness, and they accidentally hit him. And so when they get out to see what was going on, they hear Wolverine somewhere off in the woods screaming and roaring. And they're like, oh crap, okay, stay as close to the car as possible. But unfortunately though, when they after they had hit Wolverine, their car, breaks down. And so they're having to repair the car, which is around when, the woman, comes upon them and kills them. Because she ends up taking the gun that the wife had, the wife of the couple, and she takes a gun and shoots the wife and then the husband, and takes the car for herself. And Wolverine, he's watching all this, and this is something that he's still in a bit of too much of a feral state to consciously intervene. Like, there's a part of him that's screaming to intervene, but he's still so shaken up that he can't bring himself to do it. Like, he's still, too much of an animal. But then when he sees, the woman, murder the couple, and he just sort of, goes and, looks at their bodies, that's when he starts to sort of come back to his, his normal self, to where he has some measure of control. And so then we, cut to, Storm, who's being, pursued by Crimson Commando and Stonewall. And, Stonewall, ironically, is able to, she's able to put up a fight against him in such a way to where she's able to maneuver him into a trap. And, it's like this, mud pool almost, and he's stuck in it. But then he starts freaking out because he realizes he's sinking, and he's like, it's quick, this is quicksand or something, and he can't get out of it, and he's sinking even more, and he's screaming and begging for Storm to help him. And the fact that this battle-hardened warrior is in such a state of panic, Storm kind of realizes that he's not joking, and so she's debating on whether or not to save him, because she's just like, if I save him, I mean, well, one, am I going to even be able to pull him out of there because he's so heavy, and two, if I save him, isn't he just going to turn around and try and kill me? But then again, she remembers that she couldn't bring herself to murder Super Sabre, and so she hangs on at this point. The car that the woman had stolen had crashed, and they had come upon it, and Storm had knocked her out, which is when Stonewall came upon them and started fighting with Storm. So Storm, she's holding on to the car with one hand, and she's got her other arm like around Stonewall's arm, and she's got her feet planted, and she's slowly able to get him out of the quicksand. And of course they're both worn out by it, and Stonewall's sort of shocked that she saved him, and he's sort of at a loss as to what to do at this point, because he's also the one who pointed out to Crimson Commando that when they found that wire trap that Storm had made, he was able to kind of put two and two together and say, hey, she said she was definitely the one who set this up, but look, she cut it, and so Crimson Commando is like, why she did do that? I mean, she could have taken out Super Sabre right then and there. And he's like, I don't know, but maybe she's not. Maybe she's telling the truth. Maybe she's not the criminal that we're thinking she is. That kind of thing. And so he was already starting to have second thoughts about Storm, and so now her saving him, that basically clinched it. But unfortunately, though, she the woman that Storm that Storm knocked out, she comes to and she says, hey, you didn't hit me hard enough, bitch, or something along those lines. Oh, she doesn't say bitch, but it's a sentiment, right? And so she actually has this rock it's a huge rock, and she picks it up and is about to bring it down on Storm's head, which is when this knife just comes flying out of the woods and hits her in the heart and kills her. And that's when Crimson Commando comes out of the shadows and basically says, that's one down, one to go. And at that point, Wolverine stops him and says, I wouldn't do that if I were you, pal. And everyone's focused on him, Storm, Stonewall, and Crimson Commando. And he's telling them that that woman murdered a couple of ways down the road here, and so the scales have just been balanced, as far as Crimson Commando killing her. But he says, what do you want me to do, boss? Are we fighting these guys, or are we letting them go? And so they're all just kind of looking at each other, and Storm says, I don't think the situation can be resolved as easily as that, Wolverine. And so she gives Crimson Commando an opportunity to fight her. And so basically the winner walks away, and the loser is a dead body in the woods. And so she tells Wolverine to stay by Stonewall and keep him from interfering if he tries anything. And so she and Crimson Commando, they have a knife fight. And while all this is going on, Storm is kind of wrestling, with herself internally, because, she, on one hand, there's a part of her that's just screaming, to kill Crimson Commando, because she knows that, if she lets him live, he's going to come after her and Wolverine and maybe the rest of the X-Men. She's not so sure about Stonewall, but Crimson Commando, yes. And more than likely, since, him and, Stonewall served together, during World War II, even if, he has some sort of moral qualms about it, Stonewall's going to follow Crimson Commando. But in the meantime, she's also thinking, well, what if is there a way I can possibly break the cycle? Because, here's the thing. I mean, I thought I was doing the right thing by trying to protect that woman, but then by, being compassionate towards her, I allowed her to get away, and she ended up killing an innocent couple, as Wolverine just, told us. And so, she's feeling a lot of, guilt and responsibility from that. And so finally, she decides to take a third option. And she, has Crimson Commando on the ground and is that close to killing him with a knife. But instead of stabbing him in the face, she stabs the ground that's right next to his face, which, I mean, he was, freaking out, but then he's like, why'd you stop? Why aren't you killing? Why didn't you kill me? What are you doing? And so, Storm gives him and Stonewall an ultimatum, and she's, says that, if I kill you right now, Stonewall is going to try to attack us, and I'll have to kill him too, or he'll have to kill us. But if I let you go, there's no way you're going to, just let that, slide, because we know who you are now. We know what y'all do, or what y'all been doing this whole time. And if I let you go, you're going to kill us to try and, protect your secret. And so she gives him, this offer that he can't refuse. Basically, she'll let them live so long as he and Stonewall turn themselves into the authorities and confess everything that they've done. And at that point, Crimson Commando is like, then you may as well, slit my throat right then and there, right here and now. I'm not, going to throw myself, at the mercy of the government that abandoned us and threw us to the wolves. But then Stonewall, sort of, talks sense to him and says, hey, look, we started off with a noble goal, but look at what we've been doing. I mean, we've been hunting down, these people, and then, yeah, a lot of them have been criminals for sure. But, look at Storm. We thought that she was a criminal, but, she wasn't, and we were about to kill her just because she knew who we were. But she's a hero. What the hell are we doing? And he says, and how are we to know for sure if, all the people that we hunted down and killed, and all this, how do we know for sure that, all of them were criminals? Like, what if some of them were telling the truth about being innocent, And so he says, if we we'll be arrested if we turn ourselves in. But the thing is, we'll be given a chance to, tell our story to a jury of our peers. We can throw ourselves at the mercy, not of the government, but at, the court of public opinion. And, they might, find some, compassion, for us, or they might be able to understand what we're coming from. We can tell them what we're trying to do. And so he actually gets through to Crimson Commando, and, he reluctantly just says, okay, we'll turn ourselves in. And of course, Storm and Wolverine, they kind of stay nearby just to make sure that, they're, as good as their word. And sure enough, they are. Crimson Commando and Stonewall do turn themselves into the authorities, which really surprises Storm and Wolverine, because they were thinking that Crimson Commando was, just saying, okay, we'll do that just so that way, they'd have a chance to, stab Wolverine and Storm in the back. But no, they were telling the truth. And so, they, head back, to, their car, and to, go back home, and they start talking about, all this. And, Storm was asking Wolverine, is like, what happened back there? And he doesn't really want to talk about it, but he said that, just so much has happened, though, that I couldn't trust my senses. And if I can't trust my senses in the field, what good am I? Because he relies so much on that. And if they're starting to lie to him, then how is he going to be able to be a, an efficient member of the team. How is he going to be able to have his friends' backs? And so, I mean, Storm, I mean, for her part, I mean, she's talking about how, the X-Men, have always tried to live by their ideals, but, the way things are right now, especially with the Marauders and humanity in general, trying to implement measures to, eradicate mutants as of late, especially with the government trying to re-implement that Sentinel program. I mean, it's just a dark time for mutants in general right now, and it's a lot harder to try and live by the ideals. But we do need to be better than the ones we fight. And Wolverine's saying, well, yeah, I mean, I agree with you there, but how the heck are we gonna stay like that? I mean, yeah, I mean, we got lucky tonight, but at the same time, look what happened. An innocent couple got killed that didn't need to get killed, and because I was too shaken up to stop their murderer. And but I mean, yeah, we got lucky with the Crimson Commando and Stonewall, and they turned out to be good as their word. But how do we know going forward it's going to be that easy with the rest of the people that we fight? How do we know that we're going to be able to, be better, than the ones we fight as far as like morals and stuff, So that's basically how the story ends. It ends like there's a conclusion, but there's also a big cloud of uncertainty, over Storm and Wolverine right now. And so obviously Wolverine, he didn't tell Storm about picking up Jean Grey's scent, because at this point he's still thinking that he'd gone crazy or something, or maybe like an after effect of Malice's possession of him. But yeah, so that's how those stories end, and I thought that it was a good storyline. And once again, we're coming off of the heels of the Mutant Massacre, so there's still a lot of trauma from that, with the X-Men. But in regards to Storm and Wolverine, though, I mean, I thought that this was a good story that had a lot of development for them, and we see just how shaken up both Storm and Wolverine are by all these events that have happened, and how like Wolverine, he's questioning his sanity and his competence in the field. And Storm, she's questioning her capabilities as a leader, because I mean, there have been so many. I mean, she's clearly able to kill if she has to, but at the same time, she can't bring herself to deliberately set out to kill someone, or she can't bring herself to commit to that, even if it's necessary. But she is willing to kill when she has to. But she's like, how do I know when I have to kill and when I don't have to? What if when I show mercy, my opponent, uses that as the opportunity to, not only, kill me, but, my, fellow team members, or, friends or family or something like that. And so it was very fascinating, this seeing them, confront this, harsh reality that was setting in the world around them at the time. I mean, there had been some, darkness in, some of the other storylines up to this point, for sure, but there was also kind of a sense of fun as well, and genuine, enjoyable camaraderie and everything. But things have just gotten so dark as of late. I mean, with the Mutant Massacre, and especially. And so it's like a lot of the X-Men are having to, reevaluate, their values and everything, and what they're, willing to do, and, what they're not willing to do. And so, seeing them kind of, go in, carrying that, indecision and uncertainty, in this situation where it's kind of like a take off the most dangerous game, against, some unique foes. I mean, once again, Chris Claremont, he just excels at, fleshing characters out and giving them further development, albeit in, say, combat situations and things like that. So it's like we see them, as they're fighting, they're also growing, spiritually and mentally. And seeing Wolverine as shaken up as he was, I mean, that was not something you see, every day, because usually, I mean, yeah, I mean, he's a, brute when it comes to battle, but at the same time, he tends to be in control. Like, he's got the beast within cage. They lets it out every now and then, but it's under his control. So seeing him, having been traumatized from, losing control and then literally becoming an animal for a little bit, I mean, it was kind of like, yeah, he needs some help, So, and so on one hand, like, there's a part of me that's kind of frustrated that he didn't just flat out, tell Storm, it's like, hey, I smelled Jean Grey back there, but that isn't the first time I smelled her. I think we need to check this out, because if I've picked up her scent twice, and it's a recent scent, then she's still alive, and we need to find out what the hell's going on. And then, of course, had they done that, they, very well could have gotten in contact with X Factor and be like, hey guys, you're alive and all this stuff, and a lot more tragedy down the road could have been avoided, So, but at the same time, in light of what's been going on, I understand why Wolverine didn't tell Storm, because he had come off of the heels of a major shake-up, a major personal, mental, shake-up, and he was remembering that he couldn't trust himself, because he nearly killed some of his fellow team members when Malice controlled him, and even when Malice wasn't controlling him, it was, some of it was still, the paranoia had lingered to such a degree that he nearly killed Storm, and so it's like, I understand why he didn't tell Storm about picking up Jean Grey's scent. I'm frustrated that he didn't, but I understand why he didn't, though. So, but that does come back to bite them, down the road later. So trust me on that. And Storm, she continues to prove that, she was definitely, the right choice when it came to, say, leading the X-Men. So, she not only proves her capabilities in the field, like when she's, trying to get that woman, the gang leader, out of the woods, like she shows how skilled she is at like making traps and ambushes and what have you. And we already knew she was, a badass when it comes to combat, even without her powers. But we get to see that even more so because the fact that she was able to incapacitate someone like Stonewall, who is apparently incapable of being knocked down, but just, at the same time, if the terrain's being used against him, I mean, that can bring him down, as sort of to compensate for him not being able to, not for her not being able to just physically, knock him down by herself. It's like she has to use tactics and strategies and what have you. So yeah, I mean, Storm continues to, prove her, exemplary leadership, and her strategy for splitting up the X-Men is something that also makes sense as well, because, I mean, considering the Marauders' track record, I mean, not only have they, massacred the majority of the Morlocks, but, they have also, tried to, get at the X-Men through, either, attacking the mansion itself, like when Sabretooth, did so, and nearly killed Psylocke, or when Malice, took control of Dazzler as a part of a scheme of the Marauders to mess with the X-Men, So even though, even though Muir Island is all the way in Scotland, who's to say that they don't have the resources to go all the way to, that same place? And so her strategy of, putting the majority of the X-Men, namely Psylocke, Storm, and Longshot and Dazzler on the plane, I mean, it made sense. It really did. And so, of course, I mean, in her, going off to, check out, the well-being of, Jean Grey's family member, she didn't know what she was going to be walking to, if anything, and so she needed someone who, was, just as skilled as her, in the field, if not more so, and someone who'd be willing to, do what needed to be done if it came down to it. Because in the event that they did indeed come across someone like the Marauders, but thankfully they didn't come across the Marauders. They came across, the three old soldiers, and these characters are ones that I, enjoyed, because they were technically, I guess you could say, villains, they were antagonists. We'll go with that. They were antagonists. I'm not going to sit there and say that they're full-on villains, because these guys, they were clearly heroes at one point. They served their country. They fought on the front line and everything, and so, but unfortunately, the government just turned their back on them. And while it was it may have been like meant as a gesture of honor and respect, as in putting them in retirement. When you have these three superhuman soldiers, coming back home to find out that while they were gone, crime just got worse, and it only got worse as time went on. We understand where they're coming from as far as their frustration and everything, because you think that going in the mindset of a soldier going off into war, you want to think that you fighting in a foreign country, or just fighting in a war in general, is going to make a difference. It's going to matter, so when you're not only retired against your will, but also you are confronted with the fact that the home that you used to know and love is crawling with criminal scum. That can be very disillusioning. I can only imagine that, and so they definitely have a certain degree of sympathy, from, at least from me, and also from other readers as well, if you go on message boards and what have you. And like some of the dialogue does come across as a bit like overly right-wing, I guess, and reactionary, but at the same time, they're making valid points. Like on one hand, they're sort of lumping in things like sexual freedom and punk rock into the same category as straight up criminal activity, like say drug dealing or mob stuff and things like that, rape and murder, and so it's kind of like, these guys have seen some shit, but unfortunately they become so intent on cleaning, getting rid of the crime, that anything that's outside their sensibilities they see as a threat that needs to be dealt with. And so this is where we see that they're definitely dealing with some PTSD on some level, I think. But they also make the good point that all too often there have been criminals who have been able to use their connections, like say with family, or or maybe like with the mob or other criminal gangs, to maybe pay off the judge, or just bribe certain officials to look the other way. And so as a result, they might have to have their day in court, but they get off with a slap on the wrist. And it's happened all too often in reality, and so when that happens, it's very disillusioning. And so when you have three superhuman soldiers who literally fought in the greatest war ever, World War II, and coming back to face all this stuff, in a place that's supposed to be safe and secure, you kind of understand why they went the route that they did, why they decided, okay, we have a certain set of skills, and just because the government's saying that we have to stay in the shadows, that doesn't mean we can't hit back against the criminals that are being coddled by the justice system, because that is something that happens, I mean, I know that like in real life, some people are more compassionate than others and are wanting to, give every criminal a second chance, or let every criminal go, or regardless of the crime, because they're like, oh, they had a bad childhood or something. And yeah, I mean, society can really mess one up into where it's like they may feel compelled to act out or something like that. I mean, I get that, but the thing is, when acting out results in multiple people getting hurt or killed, that's when you have a problem. And so the fact that in this particular story, you have the woman and her boyfriend who were both young 20-somethings and were both well off, but were living on the streets because they enjoyed the power of running a street gang, and they had no problem dealing drugs to kids, knowing what these drugs did and not caring if any of the kids overdosed, and the fact that their families were getting them off scot-free anytime someone did do something about it. I mean, yeah, you understood why these old soldiers went after them, and and we come to find that this woman is indeed every bit the criminal that they're telling Storm and saying that they're telling Storm she is. So we definitely understand that they're in the wrong in regards to Storm, because obviously Storm is not a criminal. But at the same time, when it comes to them hunting down the woman and her boyfriend, and we see just how evil that woman is, like the fact that she murdered an innocent couple, because all she cared about, I mean, was getting out regardless of who got in her way, and she just wanted to get another high, that kind of thing. There was even a point where Chris Claremont did a pretty good job of getting inside the mind of a drug addict who was used to power, because like her mind's going a million miles a minute, and like she's freaking out, but she's like, I just need a fix, and I'm gonna kill the next person who gets in my way, things like that. And so it's like I do like how Chris Claremont played it, because from her actions and stuff, we do see that she is clearly a criminal, but we're also kind of on Storm's side, like, well, okay, is this someone who can be redeemed, or is it too late for her? Because at a certain point, we don't know. But then when she, incapacitates, Storm and Super Sabre, who is seemingly killed in this story, but he does, return, shortly, a few issues later. So just to clear that up, but yeah, when she incapacitates, Storm and Super Sabre, and then when she murders that innocent couple, that's when we kind of go back to what the old soldiers were saying. We're kind of like, you know what? I mean, you guys, you have your faults, and I'm not exactly condoning your activities as a whole, but in this instant, you guys were right. I mean, that woman and her boyfriend were every bit the criminal scum that y'all said you said they were, and they definitely deserve to be taken out of the picture, since they cheated justice so many times, that kind of thing. And plus the fact that, I mean, it's even more traumatic when this happens right in front of Wolverine, and he's still so shaken up that he literally can't bring himself to do anything about it. Like, there's a part of him that's just fighting, trying to get out and do something, because he knows that she's gonna murder these people, but he's still so far gone that he can't bring himself to do it. But that's the thing that actually gets him to start fighting back and get some control over himself. But it's a pretty traumatic moment when it happens, though, because it's an innocent couple who they were just minding their own business, and they're just trying to fix their car, and then boom, this evil bitch kills them. And so, we're definitely, like, when Crimson Commando came out of the shadows, I mean, just, by the way, it was a pretty badass, panel, like after he chunked the knife at her, and he comes out of the shadows like that. I'm like, yes, But then, of course, he has to screw it up by, turning around and trying to kill Storm, So yeah, I mean, Chris Claremont is just really good at giving us some complex characters, whether it be protagonists or antagonists. And much like the character, what he's done with the character of Magneto, he started to show us, complex, shades of the character, showing us that, I mean, yeah, the guy was a villain, but he's also making some good points. And then, as time went on, he started to humanize Magneto a lot more, to where it's like, or was he really a villain after all? Was he in the right, or the X-Men in the right? That kind of thing. And it's sort of like a microcosm of that with, these three old soldiers, except maybe not as epic of a scale as Magneto, but at the same time, he gives us these antagonists who, they are a threat, to Storm and Wolverine, or mainly to Storm, since she's the one who goes up against them. And Wolverine only comes at the end and just, makes sure that Stonewall doesn't try anything, But, I mean, at the same time, through lines of dialogue and what have you, we get the idea that, these three characters are, genuine war heroes, and, they are, in their own way, trying to do the right thing and, fight back against crime, but unfortunately, they just got so caught up in, their goal that, even if, say, someone innocent gets killed, or if they accidentally kill an innocent person, it's a small sacrifice in the grander scheme of things. I mean, that's when that, these guys, while they may have a point about going after criminals who have escaped justice, more than once, I mean, they're also in the wrong, because, they don't target innocent people, but at the same time, they don't lose any sleep over killing an innocent person. Like, say if that person was in between them and, the ones they're trying to hunt, like the guilty party, that kind of thing. So that's where, like, okay, you guys may have been, on the side of good at one point, but, you've, slid into, the side where you're starting to slide into evil here. So it's like you have these characters who believe in what they're doing, and they do have some sympathetic goals, but at the same time, they've just got such a bad case of tunnel vision that they become, as much of a threat, to society in some ways as, the ones they're trying to hunt down. And ironically, it's, only when Storm, comes across their path that they start to see the light, so to speak, where, Stonewall, it starts to have second thoughts, and then, talk Crimson Commando down at the end there. Also, I thought that it was, neat to see Madelyne Pryor again. I definitely feel sorry for the poor woman, though, because, I mean, first her husband runs out on, her and her son, and then her son is taken from her, and then, someone tries to kill her, and she doesn't even know why, that kind of thing. And we know who the Marauders are, but she doesn't. So, I mean, yeah, it's definitely a tough spot for her to be in. But I do like how, Chris Claremont, and the creative team, they start to hint that, there may be something, unnatural about her, in the sense that, one, you've got that Phoenix imagery in her nightmares. And if you recall, there was an implication that, she may well be, Phoenix or Jean Grey in a different form, but then, the way they went initially, in the original story she was introduced in, it turns out, no, she was just Madelyne Pryor. She happened to be kind of a dead ringer for Jean Grey. It was just a case of freak coincidence, and Mastermind used that to his advantage as a scheme of revenge against the X-Men. But it turned out, no, Madelyne Pryor, I mean, she's just an ordinary human who had a series of freak coincidences in her life. I mean, but here though, we start to get an idea that there may be something else going on here. So not only do we have the Phoenix imagery, which appearing in a nightmare, you're kind of like, there's some leeway. Maybe that's just another coincidence, But the fact that, it's appearing, when it does, I mean, I mean, it stands out enough. But then on the other hand, when it comes back to reality, when the doctors are talking about how, fast she's healing, or how well her body's healing, I mean, considering the amount of, physical trauma her body had, I mean, that's when, you're kind of like, okay, something's going on here. What is it? So we know that, or we get a distinct idea that, not only is, someone wanting to get rid of any trace of her, considering the fact that the Marauders took any form of identification that she had when they tried to kill her, or when they thought they killed her. But the fact that she's seen Phoenix imagery, and the fact that, her body is healing, a lot quicker than you'd expect, you start to get, this is, I think, the first implication that we've gotten outside of the story that she was introduced in, that there may be something unnatural about her. So, definitely wanting to see, how that turns out as the story goes on. But all in all, I'm going to go ahead and give these two issues, 215 and 216, Old Soldiers and Crucible, respectively, 5 out of 5 stars. These were, good issues. It was a good 2-part story, and I thought, the stories did a great job in, especially fleshing out the characters of Storm and Wolverine, and introducing us to an interesting, group of antagonists who, they're antagonists, but they're not like, I can't call them full-on bad guys, though. So, but yeah, so 5 out of 5 stars. And so I'll show y'all some of the artwork real quick. So this is where it opens up in 215, where Madelyne Pryor is having her nightmare. If you look right there, when she's reliving, her nightmare, and you see the Phoenix imagery right there. And there's Scalp Hunter and Arclight. And there they are. There's Scalp Hunter shooting her. And there's the injured X-Men being loaded up onto the plane. And here's a Longshot and Dazzler. They don't have a whole lot to do in this particular set of stories here, but I thought it was kind of neat to see them together, since one, they're both new X-Men, and two, it turns out they end up they eventually end up becoming kind of boyfriend girlfriend, but that doesn't happen until later. But I thought it was kind of a nice bit of foreshadowing, having the two of them walk side by side like this. And this is where Storm's trying to persuade Wolverine to go with her and sort of have her back. This is where Madelyne Pryor comes to in the hospital. I've always liked Alan Davis's art style. I mean, it's sort of a good balance of realism with a bit of a cartoonish look at the same time. And Storm and Wolverine driving off to check out the place, and I don't know how Storm is standing all that cigarette smoke, but really good facial expressions. And another thing that comes up is when she's talking, when she's thinking about how the Marauders are striking at their friends and loved ones, she's thinking about Forge, the guy who invented the weapon that took her powers, and how she and Forge have this sort of strange, love story thing going on between one another, where it's like she loves him and hates him at the same time. But and this kind of puts her down the road to, consider swallowing her pride and asking, Forge to, give her powers back. Like if he can invent a weapon that can undo the effects of that, other weapon that was used to take away her powers, So. And this is where Wolverine just kind of, loses his shit right here and accidentally knocks Storm out after getting the scent of Jean Grey. Another little bit right here. Like, I know how the majority of the focus is on Storm and Wolverine, but, Shadowcat, she, goes through, she leaves her, storage device or pod or whatever, and, she's looking at Longshot, because, she thinks he's cute, and she's thinking that she's going to die, she may as well, kiss someone who looks like a prince, and thinking that he's not even going to feel it, but he actually feels it. He feels her, kiss his cheek. And when that happens, I forgot to mention this, but he, when that happens, he's able to read objects, right? Like he's able to, pick up a lot of history of, the, X-Men's mansion, by like touching some of this stuff and just, and getting like memories from touching objects, right? But a similar thing happens when Shadowcat in her tangible form, kisses him on the cheek, and he gets this, image of, all these, chaotic, pictures, being swallowed up by this void that's just hungry for her. And he's asking Rogue, is this death? And Rogue's like, I don't know, And so I'm sorry I forgot to mention that, but it's just that so much of the story is focused on Storm and Wolverine that, these little small moments, kind of get lost in my head. But then, just, looking at some of this stuff, I'm like, yeah, even the small stuff was good, But that kind of just adds, a little more to the, intrigue of Longshot's character, because it's like if he can, get an object's history just by touching it, psychometry, and then having a similar thing happen with someone who's more or less a ghost. What happens if, there's a story where they have to interact with ghosts? Can he, do something like that with them too? Opens all sorts of doors. And this is, Storm coming to and finding out she's been taken prisoner, but her being a former thief, she's able to, escape and what have you. And that's where, she finds the woman who turns out to be a criminal, but she's finding all the trophies and all the stuff, being used as trophies. And she ends up, meeting the 3 old soldiers for the first time. And so, yeah, she's actually able to put up a pretty good fight against them, but then again, when you're dealing with someone who can go at Mach 1, a little love tap from him just knocks her out. But I really like this artwork right here, where we get to, see them, without their masks. Especially like right here. And we see the old soldiers as old soldiers. There we go. After their head start, night falls and the three of them pursue. So here with 216, after the awesome Barry Windsor Smith cover, we get this amazing shot of Wolverine by Jackson Guice. This is where that motorist couple accidentally hits him and then damages their car. And here's Wolverine just basically losing his shit right here. And Storm in the grill, and Storm's trying to make the trap. And this is where, we're starting to get the idea that, this, girl may not be, as, innocent that Storm's thinking that she is. Like, she knows that the girl is a criminal, but at the same time, she's thinking that she could be redeemed, but she's, starting to wonder, There's Super Sabre heading towards their trap. And this is right after, Storm cut the trap to, make it to where Super Sabre wouldn't get his head cut off, So this is, right after that, and the woman's really starting to, question, the wisdom of following Storm. And here's, Moira McTaggart on Muir Island, and the X-Men arriving on the plane, and, with a sonic boom, and accidentally waking everyone up on the island. But considering that they're urgent to get there because of their injured team members, urgency is understandable. Like this, imagery right here of Psylocke's butterfly eyes, whenever she uses her telepathic abilities, it's like, that's how it sort of symbolizes how she's able to, like, see stuff telepathically, And so this is where Stonewall and Crimson Commando, they come across, the trap that Storm had cut, and they realize that, or they sort of put two and two together, or at least Stonewall does, and starts to wonder, are we doing the right thing by going after Storm? Like, I understand going after the other woman, but Storm, is she even, really a criminal? Or should we even be trying to kill her? But and Crimson Commando had accidentally reactivated the trap, and so Stonewall steps in front of Super Sabre's way to keep him from getting his head cut off. And Storm's able to later ambush Super Sabre and kind of use the terrain against him. But of course, this is where, the woman, causes a little avalanche to fall on them. And there's a motorist couple, right when they're fixing their car, and Wolverine's off in the distance, and it's still in his feral state, but still, watching them. And then he knows that she's going to do something to him, and he's like, there's a part of him that's just fighting to get out and stop it, but he can't. But yeah, she ends up murdering them. But that actually causes Wolverine to snap out of it. So here, Crimson Commando and Stonewall, were, trying to look through the rubble to find their friend, Super Sabre, but they can't find him, and so it's like they're thinking that he's dead, and so they decide to go after Storm, and the truck or car that the woman stole ended up crashing because it wasn't fully fixed, and Storm found her. Knocked her out and sprung a trap on Stonewall. But this is where she rescues him from the quicksand, which in turn leaves her vulnerable to the woman who's about to hit her with the rock. And then you get that awesome bit where the knife comes flying out of the woods, hits her in the heart, and then out comes Crimson Commando. Thought that was just a pretty badass picture right there. So it goes from, on one hand you're cheering for Crimson Commando to they took out that scumbag woman, but then the fact that he's about to try and do the same thing in Storm, you're like, oh dude, you had it but you lost it. But then Wolverine's come back to his senses and stops Crimson Commando there. And then Storm and Crimson Commando have their knife fight. Some good fight choreography there. Jackson Guice. And then Storm gives them the ultimatum. After after Stonewall and Crimson Commando turn themselves in, Storm and Wolverine go riding off. But yeah, there you go. That was issues 215 and 216, Old Soldiers and Old Soldiers and Crucible. So 5 out of 5 stars. So if you made it this far, thank you very much for taking the time to check out the review and going along for the ride. And if you like what you see here, feel free to like and subscribe. So y'all get questions, comments, drop a line, let me know. So y'all take care. Have a good day. Bye.